Excellent. Thanks, Rachel. And thanks, Rachel, Ian, and Leisha for inviting me today. So I'm really looking forward to sort of having this discussion with everyone. As Rachel mentioned, I'm Mary Makinde. I'm a senior lecturer on the Forensic Investigation Programme at Canterbury Christchurch University, and I'm also the university's Closing Our Gap strategic lead. In terms of that role, that sort of in my strategic lead role, that very much spans across the entirety of the university, looking at the ethnicity awarding gap. So really working with staff and students, which has kind of led me on to some of this work, and how I bring my passion for forensics together with my passion for sort of social justice in education as well. So as Rachel said, there will be some sort of room for discussion. I normally spend a day sort of training people around sort of decolonise the curriculum and talking about decolonising. So we're sort of talking, we've just taken a snapshot of the whole thing, but please do come and grab me or drop me an email if you do have any questions or want to talk about anything. So it's great to be here. So I will, I've started with this quote from Nelson Mandela around education is the most powerful weapon we can use to change the world. And from a young age, I've always been passionate about the power of education and how it can allow for social mobility. And but it suddenly struck me the more I got into sort of, well, when I got into academia, that I realised that actually one of the things, whilst I still believe this quote is true, we also have to consider whose education and how is that education used as a weapon? Is it used to change, for positive change, or is it used as a weapon to control? So I'll let you guys think about that and to sort of mold that over a little bit in that respect. But when we are talking about how powerful education is, it also depends on how we choose to use it. And so really my talk is going to be focused on around sort of how can we start to decolonise the forensic curriculum, particularly just sort of starting with initial discussions around what is decolonising and what does it mean to you. So really I kind of also want you guys to really think about like if you are an educator in academia or in any shape or form, or even if you do training, if you're a professional, if you're a forensic scientist and you deliver training, think about how you plan your sessions, how you plan your lessons. Do you consider the experiences of your students? Do you consider the sort of different perspective and different cultures as part of that? Do you provide opportunities that encourage sort of new form of knowledge and sort of particularly through a critical lens? And how do you facilitate student learning so that they can draw upon their own personal experiences and knowledge as well? And so I'm going to start with some discussion, really thinking about some of these questions that I've got in front of you is from your own perspective and your own understanding, what and how would you, what is knowledge? How do we acquire knowledge? How do we value knowledge? And does knowledge have an identity? So just kind of sort of happy for people to take their mics off, and sort of to turn their cameras on if they just sort of want to share their thoughts on those questions around knowledge.
I'm happy to speak, Mary, just while other people are typing. That's a hard question. What is knowledge? I'm automatically drawn to the ontology and epistemology and thinking about the nature of knowledge. But I think for me, it's two things. It's kind of how can I put this? The facts and attributes and skills that you gain through experience, but also the things that you know to be true. So on one side, it's kind of the stuff that you learn from learn through experience, but it's also the stuff you know to be true from the world, your experiences. So there's kind of two dimensions there, the kind of learn part and what you know to be true, your kind of your intrinsic values and principles. So that's probably a bit wishy-washy definition, but that's what I'd say knowledge is.
Thank you, Ian. And there's nothing wishy-washy about that at all. So very much around our facts, our experiences, what we learn, what we know to be true. Um, Sort of, David, I can see you put something in the chat. Do you mind sort of expanding on that for everyone, please? you don't mind.
Not at all. The problem about some areas of knowledge is we have a massive big background of knowledge. For example, photography around about 150 years. So we can't put all that knowledge in all our students. So we have to choose what they learn and what they don't learn. Otherwise, it'd just be too much. But we have to be careful we don't forget techniques in the past that we've been used in the past that are still valuable in the future as they are now. So it's that whole thing about not reinventing the wheel, not throwing out the baby with the bathwater in terms of knowledge.
Thank you. And I think one of the things that really sort of struck me what you said there is about we can't teach everything, so we choose some elements to teach our students and others not. Who makes that decision? And then in that kind of is the third question, really. How do we value knowledge, and which knowledge in that respect do we sort of pass on to our students?
I think we need our own personal understanding of what's required, but also these days to actually bring in liaison people from the real world, from CSI. So we're giving what the CSI need from our students. So that's where I think I have to be thinking about employability. So where are they going to afterwards? What they need to know to be able to do the job in the real world.
Yeah, and I think you raised a valuable point there around employability. As educators, and as even from my perspective as somebody who's been a practitioner as well, I'm always hammering to my students that those employability skills. Like in my department, I lead on that for forensics, and it's actually I need to get you ready for the real world. I need to give you the skills in order to be able to do the job that you've set out you want to do, so that you can reach your career aspirations. And so really when we're thinking about that, we also have to think about actually what is education, and what is the purpose of universities as in that respect as well. Are we, and this I've got to admit, when I first started in academia, I there was a bit of a battle between, am I preparing my students so that I'm training them to go and be a forensic scientist, or am I providing them with the opportunities to see themselves in the world? So is education more about acquiring a set of skills, or is education about students being ready for the world and seeing themselves in the world? I'm going to throw it out there. I'm not in no way saying anything is right or wrong here.
I think one feedback I have from one thing I had feedback from one student a long time ago was they actually did this kind of more scientific photography with me and scientific imaging. Said, all that rubbish you gave me, David, I didn't really understand. I now use it in my work. So although it wasn't very useful when I learnt it, it's been useful now in my employment. So it's that kind of scenario. So we need to know what we need to know. We need them to know for when they do get into employment.
Thank you. And so, Ian.
Yeah, I've been thinking more about your question, Mary, and I think when we teach students, I think people focus on knowledge as knowing stuff about the subject, like facts about forensics, techniques to use in forensics. But I think there's two other important points. One is the general nature of how science works, so the scientific method and how we evaluate new techniques and approaches, which obviously translates beyond the subject. But and the third part of it is also that kind of critical thinking process. So when they're faced with a real challenge outside of the world of work, which wasn't linked to one of the facts we taught them, they can apply their own thinking skills. I mean, employers certainly want the last thing I just said, but I think the curriculum is often driven by the facts and the techniques, which we obviously pick ourselves, you know, based on our own experiences and skills and what we've been taught.
Thank you, Ian. I'm just going to go to Rachel there. See, she's got a hand up as well.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this as well, and I think obviously what David mentioned earlier about, you know, where our graduates are likely to be employed is really important, whether it's for accreditation purposes or whether it's actually to make sure that they have the right legal framework and appropriate skill set for the jobs they're likely to undertake after graduation. But I think it's really important, particularly in forensics, because a lot of the practices actually differ, you know, depending on what police force you work for, which laboratory. The practices, the theory might be the same, but the actual training or the particular policies, etc., will differ. And I think, you know, whether that's in one country or across the world, and the access to the techniques that they use are also going to differ depending on where they're based in the world or even in the country. And I think for me, that knowledge is about making them aware of all the differences and similarities that might exist, and being able to know that there isn't necessarily a one size fits all, and that practice or that thing that they might have been taught might change tomorrow with some new technique, some new research, a new case, a new context. And you know, that knowledge isn't necessarily then set in stone.
Thank you, Rachel. So very much really thinking about, yeah, that sort of access, the fact that we have knowledge and it can change over time. Obviously, John, you've got your hand up. Please go ahead.
Sorry for the delay. I was looking for the button for the mic. If I was prepared for the questions, I would have got out a presentation, a bit of work that I did several years ago, and I can't remember now what there's a suggestion of we can think of knowledge in sort of 3 classifications. One was something like linguistic, another one was tacit, and I think another was experiential or something. I can't remember exactly what they were, but it's quite a nice way of thinking about how do we know what we know, that we gather through doing the research and studying it, and then coming up with studies and facts and establishing a body of knowledge. And we make choices about what we study, and there's some kind of, you know, value system that goes into deciding what we study to produce that accumulated body of knowledge, and that becomes almost like the canon, if you like, for that discipline. And then there are other things that we sort of think we know, or we've got a subjective experience of, that we try to make a link with that established body of knowledge. And until we do the rigorous research on that, we can't necessarily say that that's, you know, fully understood and reliable. And then there are other forms of knowledge that came into things like, you know, we all know what it feels like to be in love or scared or something, but it's something that you can't actually write down or explain in an easily understood way, but you kind of know that you have that experience. Anyway, that's my little contribution for the moment. But it's really, really big and interesting questions that I'm sitting here being quiet, but really thinking about it.
Yeah, I thought I'd wake you guys up, considering it's just after lunch. And so thank you everybody for that, and sort of cautious about the time. And so completely thinking about, we do have different forms of knowledge. So things like experiential knowledge, functional knowledge. Knowledge is acquired in so many different ways. What people haven't quite mentioned is where we talk about how we acquire knowledge and how we value knowledge as well, particularly how we acquire knowledge. We also need to think about acquisition through collective knowledge. So that collectiveness of everybody bringing in their own perspectives, their own experiences together. And that can be the most powerful form of knowledge, is that sort of collective knowledge and how it's built together. And so therefore that will lead to, how do we value it? Are we valuing some forms of knowledge? So particularly in a profession like forensics, quite often we value things like functional knowledge. So like I think it was Rachel, you mentioned about sort of giving our students the tools to be able to solve a problem. And then sort of as you get into the profession, people start to value a bit more your experiential knowledge. And so where does it switch, and why does one outweigh, why is one preferred over the other? So they're not, this session isn't really, there are no answers, to be honest, but it's just an opportunity for us to really reflect and think about how do we bring our knowledge together and how we value. But one of the other things to really think about is our knowledge gaps. We never often think about this. So do you know what you don't know? What do you not know? Why do you not know those things? And also really considering what are the implications of you not knowing. and how does that plan out, particularly within the classroom space, if that makes sense. So again, thinking about our knowledge gaps, we have our explicit knowledge, so knowledge that we know we have, which is great because that's usually where we're quite comfortable and we see ourselves able to sort of impart that knowledge. The knowledge we don't know we have, so sort of our known gap, that is also generally quite fine, especially from a forensic perspective, because we can say that's not my area of expertise, I will pass you on to this person. So we can generally be quite comfortable saying we don't have that. As educators, we're not necessarily always as comfortable in terms of saying to our students, again, thinking about that power dynamic within the classroom space, we're not necessarily always as comfortable saying to students, I don't know. Why don't you teach me about that, or why don't you share your experiences? And actually, when we say actually we don't know, actually that can be quite powerful within the classroom space, because it provides an opportunity that actually decenters us as the educator and allows our students to come in as partners in that creation of that collective knowledge, in terms of the acquisition of everybody within that space. And then you've got the sort of your implicit knowledge, so knowledge you don't know you have. From my perspective, that's usually quite great when someone asks me a question and I give the answer, and it's almost like my mouth moves before my brain even connects and realizes that I know that knowledge. That's always a surprise for me. And then the real danger bit really for us is the knowledge that is sort of that are unknown gaps, so the knowledge we don't know we don't have, because that's the bit that's often quite missing, and that's the bit that our students in particular will never get to acquire, and often that's the bit that's also replicated over time in our teaching practices. So when we're thinking about colonisation, it's very much sort of by definition, colonisation is the action or process of settling among and establishing control over Indigenous people, in particular of an area. But when we're sort of thinking about colonisation in terms of sort of knowledge, we need to also think about sort of like the discourses in relation to that. So how we sort of determine how people think, how people talk, how people act, behave, what knowledge is passed on, what knowledge isn't passed on. And so what knowledge is considered valuable and what knowledge isn't. So it's very much sort of power-based, and how we make use of that knowledge as well. So on the other hand, you've got sort of power. So if you've got knowledge that you value, that knowledge that you value is always going to get passed on. And so that becomes the knowledge that's reproduced and shapes our understanding of our theories, of our practices, and of our profession, because we're recreating that all the time. Yeah. And so if we start to think about that in particular, especially when we're thinking about the colonisation of knowledge and how it sits in terms of power, in forensics, we often talk about the expert. We're often seen as the expert witness in a particular case. And whilst that is great, and I understand it in terms of we're supposed to have more knowledge than the average the average person of a given area, within our professional practice, but also particularly within the classroom, when we start to see ourselves as expert, we also become the gatekeepers of knowledge, unless we start to pass that on, and unless we start to acquire from others as well. So it's just to sort of consider that, is it that everybody's an expert, or are we an expert and therefore the gatekeeper of that knowledge? Yeah. And we can kind of see that in how it's planned out, particularly around sustainability. So we know the FSS was the largest forensic science provider up until 2012. And so there was a lot of knowledge being produced there through research, through cases. But when that shut, where did that knowledge go? Obviously, some of it did go to other forensic science providers. Some of it just disappeared. And so again, it's realizing that actually when we do see ourselves as experts and we hold on to that knowledge, we do become the gatekeepers of that. So it's really thinking about that sort of collective knowledge as well. So how does that really plan out in academia? So we're sort of thinking about sort of in academia, we've got our sort of knowledge canyons, we've got our Eurocentric canyons. It's very Western. It's our research and views are very much based on the Western traditions, Western techniques. So I know, Rachel, earlier you talked about access to techniques. Who has access to those techniques? Who has access to those instruments, the books, the funding that's associated? So we start to disregard, as if some people don't have access to something, we start to disregard their work or their experiences, and so that potentially produces systems of oppression, system of exclusion, them and us. So again, when we start to sort of really think about that, you start to sort of get, particularly within the classroom space, what you start to have is students who are taught one thing, a bit of information that gets pre-produced. So for example, if we look at a lot of the books and the techniques that we use within the classroom space, there's from the global north, so from the UK, from America, from Australia. And so quite often they are sort of the voices of white individuals, particularly white males. And so if students, so essentially what students are being taught is subjects and knowledge that doesn't include their own voices. And so they're simply taught to reproduce that knowledge. And so then we have to think about, how does that provide them opportunities to use their own voices? So quite often in the classroom space, our white students' voices are affirmed, but our Black, Asian and ethnic minority and other minoritized groups are sort of hidden and silenced. So again, really thinking about, if we're trying to empower our students, particularly around when we're trying to eradicate things like the degree awarding gap, is how do we bring our student voices into that space? Essentially, this kind of explains it really well, because often as educators, we are there, we go, right, this is what you need to learn. So that functional knowledge that we often try and pass on, particularly within the forensic curriculum, is you are there to learn this, for example, about DNA, the structure of DNA, and how you examine hair to determine identity or ethnic origin. And then students become sort of depositories of that information. Yeah, so we're very much transmitting knowledge. Yeah, not necessarily thinking about the different ways of people that people acquire knowledge. So people can acquire knowledge through play, through carrying out experiments, through sort of listening, through debates. There's so many different ways of acquiring knowledge that actually we often just focus on just the function of knowledge in that respect. So I'm going to sort of pause there and ask you a question around, what does decolonising mean to you? Everyone's thoughts on sort of decolonising. No thoughts?
I'll speak, Mary, just to give people a chance to think themselves, and I'll talk slowly. For me, it's meant different things over the last 2 years. I was first introduced to some of the broader things you talked about, and the concepts related particularly to, knowledge in the form of materials such as reading lists. But now I think for me it means, in the simplest way, and I can express it, a curriculum that is, I'm trying to find the right verb in there, applicable to everybody, a curriculum that belongs to everybody. I think that's the best way, but a curriculum that belongs to everybody. And just to add a little more detail on that, so the students co-create and bring their own experiences, their own cultural backgrounds into the curriculum and help shape it with me as a facilitator and educator. So, a classic example would be if you're talking about doing an engineering lecture on the mechanics of bridge building. You may give an example of a bridge in the class, but you'd ask the students to bring their own bridge example, full stop, in order to do the modelling, and they can bring bridge from anywhere, any part of their life, any aspect, in order to apply that learning, which brings their own experiences in, and then obviously share that with the class.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Ian. And I liked the fact that you started off, you were quite open and said, you did think it before you were talking about reading lists as part of decolonizing, but then now you're actually realizing it's more about sort of the co-creation, creating a curriculum in which people feel like they're a part of it, they belong, that represents everybody. And that is what essentially we're trying to achieve with decolonizing the curriculum. And so often, particularly in HE, we talk about sort of inclusive curriculum, diversifying the curriculum. And it's really, really important for us to remember that decolonizing the curriculum is very different from diversifying the curriculum. And in order to truly have an inclusive curriculum, we have to have a decolonized curriculum. So when we're talking about diversifying the curriculum, this is really about things like using a range of different perspectives. So yes, like the reading list and having diverse reading lists, having diverse learning strategies and assessments. What diversifying doesn't allow you to do, it doesn't allow you to challenge hierarchies and inequalities that are actually embedded in the assumptions that we make. So within our curriculum and within our profession. So it doesn't really provide those sort of interrogatory opportunities. And so again, what then that allows is for those assumptions, because they haven't been dismantled, to be reproduced over and over and over again without anybody sort of challenging them. So decolonizing is actually going deeper than that. It is really about that sort of interrogation. And this is why I quite like this diagram at the bottom, where you've got equality, equity, and liberation. In that liberation, some people say social justice, where we're often working towards equality, and so we're treating everybody the same. But actually, what we've started to work towards now within HE, and quite often within society, is equity, sort of realizing that different people require different things to have equality of outcomes. But actually, when we're talking about decolonizing, it's actually about removing some of those barriers completely, so that people don't necessarily need all those additional things that we say that we think they need. And so when we are sort of decolonizing the curriculum, because we are going beyond, and I really urge anybody that thinks decolonizing is just about the reading list, because I do hear it from HE colleagues sometimes when they say, oh, I've started to decolonize my curriculum. I've started to use diverse reading list. It's actually far more than that. It's far more than the reading list. It's to truly decolonize. We really have to think about having that sort of paradigm shift in our culture, in our mindset, in our practices. It's a shift that requires us to really think about what is knowledge. So those questions I asked earlier, how do we acquire knowledge? How do we value knowledge? How is knowledge disseminated? Yeah, is really important, particularly in our work, because thinking about the role of open access in that respect as well. But also what knowledge is included and what knowledge is excluded and why. Yeah, all of this is really about what decolonizing should be. And so we shouldn't be, and when we decolonize, and although I'm talking about race here quite a bit, it's not just about race. It's really about race, ethnicity, gender, class, sexuality, religion, nationality. It's about bringing everybody into that space so that actually we are enriching our curriculum. Often when we talk about decolonizing, people think we're taking stuff out. And I'm not asking anybody to take stuff out. That is not what decolonizing means. It's about bringing stuff in. So voices that have been omitted in the past, bring them in, enrich the curriculum. Often people's arguments around decolonizing is that if we don't have time to embed that into the curriculum, or it's if we sort of bring in those that research in or that piece of work in, it's not of high quality, and therefore we've already put a value on what is quality and what isn't. And actually, we talk about forensics being a science, but actually, in order for it to be truly reflective, actually it should have all the different voices so that we can truly integrate it, and so that our students can develop that critical thinking in their approach as well. I hope that makes sense. So then also thinking about our research and decolonizing our research practices as well. So to decolonize our research, we also really need to understand our identities as researchers. Where are we coming from? What has been our own experiences, and how does that inform our research? And so as a researcher, we have to decenter the focus and the aim of that research from us And actually, particularly if we're doing it in other countries or in other in marginalised groups, is to actually centre the agenda of the marginalised group. So, for example, I do some work around sort of violence against women and girls and sexual offences, and we often talk about the need to increase reporting from marginalised groups like LGBTQ or ethnic minorities, but actually, are we producing, when we're doing our research, are we bringing their voices in, and are we doing it in a way that centres them? So really adopting that their sort of understanding of knowledge, that the way that they acquire knowledge and their cultures and their methodologies as well. So what I've done across my university is I've developed a Decolonising the Curriculum health check, and it provides opportunities for colleagues to really interrogate their curriculum and the design of it and the assumptions and the structures and hierarchies that go within it. I'll put the link in the chat in a little moment. But it's divided into course level, module level, and sort of staff development in order to help colleagues sort of recognise how they can develop themselves, but also work with students in order to ensure that the curriculum is truly representative of the society in which we live in, so that our students can see themselves in the world as well. And so as part of it, so the first part very much looks at building identity, belonging and community within that classroom space. So fostering good relationships, developing compassion in learners, but also developing key skills like criticality, integrity, which is really important within the forensic sort of arena. Things like cultural capital. So really looking at what assumptions does our course rely on? Yeah. Where have those assumptions come from, and how is that built and shaped our knowledge and understanding of our topic area? And then the final bit is really around staff development. So that's really what I found when I worked with colleagues to try and understand what their challenges were, was that sometimes it could just be that they just didn't know how to facilitate conversations on race. So again, developing workshops and providing that space. So what is it that they potentially need help with? So this is something that they can also do with their line managers as well. And colleagues have fed back that it's been a really useful tool to help them organise their thinking, but also identify what they do really well in terms of best practice, but areas where actually they need to develop more and work with students. And so again, it's often used in like periodic programme reviews, our boards of studies and student rep meetings as well. So when we are decolonising, it's very much we need to sort of take sort of these three main steps. So first, accepting that we have been colonised and that we do have assumptions built in our profession, in our sort of curriculum. So that's really a point of critical reflection. Then we've got to look at how do we start to deconstruct, dismantle and unlearn the things that we've learned. And that effectively is about bringing in the different perspectives, the different voices, and enriching the curriculum. And so therefore we start to decenter whiteness or decenter heterosexual normality, whatever we think is the norm, we decenter that. And then we start to relearn, reconstruct and rebuild. And that should be done collectively. Yeah, it should be about that collective acquisition of knowledge. And then what we're building is education for social justice in that as well. And so really thinking about when we are decolonising the curriculum, particularly when we're working with students, it's that we've got to think about, I tend to say to colleagues, think about sort of how do we build identity, build community and build competence. That competence element is really, really important for forensics. But actually that will come once, what I find is that once you have a curriculum that allows the students to see themselves in it, but also as contributors to the profession and the wider society, it then allows them to build a connection with people, with other students within that classroom space, and build a connection with the subject area, and actually the competence element comes off the back of that as well. And so I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of how we've done it in our approach and how I've done it in a module. So So I've got a module that I'll talk about, but quite often when I see guest lecturers, or when I was at university, or when I go attend conferences and I see case studies, there's often a risk of perpetuating stereotypes. So it would be great because they'll think, right, I'm including a case study, and so they'll often reproduce stereotypes. So, for example, black men and sort of drugs and gangs, Asian men and sort of terrorism, Asian men and grooming, in which white females are the victims. And that within a classroom space, if you're one of two or very few black, Asian and ethnic minority students, that can put you in a quite a vulnerable space. So again, it's thinking about how are we perpetuating stereotypes within our curriculum as well, or how are we challenging stereotypes as well, and sort of breaking down barriers. I went to university about 20 years ago. These are the books that I used at university, and whilst they're great books by great authors, these are the books that we still currently use within sort of forensics. Yeah, so it means that often this is the books that we value, this is the knowledge we value, so therefore anybody outside of this is not used, and so therefore we're not valuing that knowledge. So we need to think about, actually, are there other books that we can use to bring in different perspectives, different authors? And I know there is a challenge around this because I have contacted publishers to sort of see what books they have that's not from the UK, America, or Australia, and pretty much there isn't any. So again, maybe look at opportunities where you can collaborate with your students, either to produce papers, to co-author books as well. So just to talk to you briefly about one of my modules in which I worked to sort of decolonize, and it's called Reconstructing Crime Events. It's a second year module, and it's an optional module that's open to combined honours students and single honours students as well. And previously, before I took on the module, it was a module that was delivered 4 hours a week. It was lectures. It's a multidisciplinary module, and students would sort of get case studies and opportunities to learn from different disciplines around. So for instance, in my case, it'd be like forensic biology. What do we do as forensic biologists to reconstruct the events that occurred as part of a crime? For this module, students had sort of 2 assessments. One was a group presentation, one was an unseen exam of equal weighting. But when I took it on, the student outcomes on it was quite low. And I found that our Black, Asian and ethnic minority students weren't doing as well either. Student engagement was quite poor as well. And what was interesting for me was when I was in a student rep meeting, the feedback from the students was, oh, I really enjoyed listening to the case studies in that session, and I thought they'd never mentioned anything about learning, so that was quite concerning. It just felt like they just could have just sat and watched something on the TV or Netflix and got that same information. So I know you can't really see this very well, but I went back and I did some Biggs's reconstructive alignment, looking at the assessments, what I'm trying to get the students to achieve. But alongside that, I worked with that building identity, building community, and building competence as part of it. So I redesigned the module such that students got a case study, because previously for their presentation, they would have to pick a case from history. So it could be, for example, any case. It could be sort of like the 7/7 bombings, and look at how they reconstructed the events that occurred in that from a forensic perspective, and then they would present on it. So I wanted them to be a part of the process. So I actually developed my own case based on cases that I've worked on in the past. But I also looked at, and I'm going to be honest, when I was doing this, I thought this was a bit tokenistic, and it is a little bit, but I didn't realise the impact it was going to have on my students. So when I was writing the MG21 paperwork and developing the case, I had the CSI, like Black, Asian and ethnic minority students, as positive role models in that. So like as the CSI, the police officer, the CSM, but also it was based on the nationality of the students that I had in that class as well. But I also had our white students as positive role models as well. And actually the students fed back that they actually went home and told their parents about how exciting it was to see a Nigerian name or Bangladeshi name as a CSI, and it just made all the difference for them. And then I designed the case so that the students were co-creators of knowledge, so that they were divided into 10 groups, and each group had a forensic discipline that fitted into the wider case. And so they essentially had to work together in order to determine what happened in that case. I collaborated with Kent Police, so it was like a joint live brief, and we worked together on it. And I became a facilitator as opposed to an educator, and the students became the creators of that knowledge collectively. So for instance, the forensic entomologist would have to talk to the forensic toxicologist to find out if there was drugs in the system of the victims, those sort of things, and then build their case on top of that. The students loved it because they went from having 4-hour lectures, they were now sort of having a few lectures and actually now doing the work themselves, so physically working through the case, but also going on trips with Kent Police and doing like the live brief with them. So in terms of student outcomes, what we got was that, so in 2018, that was before I took it over, and then sort of year on year, the attainment increased, and the student outcomes got a lot better. And what I found was that because the students were doing and they were working together to create that knowledge, it became quite powerful, but it also built really good relationships with the students, and they were able to develop those functional skills and knowledge that we needed them to develop as well. In terms of our Black, Asian and ethnic minority students, where there was previously a massive gap, I think it's about 18% between our white students and our Black, Asian and ethnic minority students, that gap narrowed year on year. And so there was no difference between the outcomes of our white students, no significant difference between the outcomes of our white students and our Black, Asian and ethnic minority students. And actually year on year, students actually tell me that that's the best model they do, because actually they actually build a sense of belonging because they are working together to create that knowledge. And then another way that we can do it is very much looking at actually embedding actual modules and through course design, so that it's very much looking at opportunities for either social justice or interrogating the history of forensics, and really providing opportunities for students to sort of increase their empathy, challenge misconceptions, dismantle assumptions in that as well. And so with this, we're having more sort of reflective assessments, intergroup dialogue, that sort of self-peer reflections as well, really plays a part of it as well. So it's almost finished here. And so with that, if we're going to embed it into the curriculum and actually have it as a particular module or a series of modules, it's really then thinking about the content of the course to ensure that it's got a range of different perspectives and a range of different learning tools. But when we're decolonizing the curriculum, it's really important that we are embedding it all the way through. So even myself, when I'm talking about DNA, I'm often getting students to think about different things like the DNA database and providing it as an opportunity to discuss sort of the database and race. But also when I'm talking about DNA, I might get them to think about sort of things like, if my victim is a transgender female, how might their DNA look like? What is your role as the forensic scientist when you're reporting that as an expert witness? So always embedding it all the way through so that it's a consistent message, as opposed to just an add-on or something that comes across as tokenistic. And so really, when we're sort of moving forward in this part of the Decolonising health checklist, it's really getting colleagues to think about, we need to think about the concept of our course. So what goes into it, the content, the delivery, the assessments and feedback. And so it shouldn't just be, often when we're thinking about decolonising the curriculum, people only ever think about the content, but actually we need to think about the concept, how it's delivered, who it's delivered by, and what mode, like what essentially, even what mode it's been delivered. So using a range of different techniques. And the assessments, are they providing opportunities to sort of assess how different students learn and acquire knowledge as well. And so this is my last slide. So I put this in because I think it really, people say to me, well, we can't do it, we don't have time to do this, but it really, we need to find the time. Yeah. Essentially, we need to be doing it because it's the right thing to do. It's around social justice. Also, there are implications on society and the professions. We've seen there's a lot of stuff around cognitive bias and the impact of cognitive bias within our profession. And also now the new QAA standards includes it. And so I've put some sort of, again, why does it matter? I've put some results there, and that result, so the 2018 to 2019 results represents the results of one of my students, where sort of halfway through her second year, that was her average. Her average was 47%. By the time I started to work with her, and then she got opportunities to have a curriculum that really shaped her, she ended up averaging in her final year 77%. She ended up graduating with a 2-1 and is now working within forensics, but it was an area that she actually genuinely thought she couldn't get into because of the colour of her skin, because she hadn't actually seen anybody that looked like her in the past become a forensic scientist until she met me. So she just wasn't sure. But again, it's about actually representing that, providing opportunities for our students to learn. So I think I'll stop there and thank you. I am open to questions.
Thank you, Mary. That was absolutely amazing. And there's lots of applause coming in from everyone in the meeting today. But there's a couple of questions in the chat, and I'm sure there'll be other people that want to come in. Ian, do you have another question you want to ask Mary at this point, or shall I ask your question from the chat? Okay, so one of the questions David asks, isn't there a big role for PSRBs? So for anyone not familiar with that term, who's in the community in the meeting today, PSRB relates to professional, statutory and regulatory bodies. So for example, an example of that in our sector would be the Chartered Society of Forensic Sciences, for example, who accredit many courses within the UK. So your thoughts on that, Mary?
I think absolutely, David. I think this is where we have to work collaboratively in this. I think sort of the Chartered Society does have a part to play in this, and there is some work going on with the Chartered Society, with members of the Chartered Society and the Forensic Capability Network that are actually looking at sort of diversity within sort of forensics. I think it's a case of, if we are not looking at it, if we're just purely looking at it from an academic point of view, it's easier then for us to say, okay, well, actually in the profession they just need to be able to do the job. But actually we've seen the impact of cognitive bias on our profession. But we've also, if we're not creating students who can, and not young people, but people who are critical thinking and able to sort of challenge assumptions, actually that really goes against what we do as forensic scientists. As a forensic scientist, I'm there to sort of think about the prosecution hypothesis, the defense hypothesis, what are the different possibilities, and actually so embedding those skills into the curriculum and providing students an opportunity to learn from each other, but also that general collective knowledge is a real big important part of it. I think PSRBs massively need to be involved, and we should all be working collaboratively. So yeah, I think that's a great question, but there is some work in that, and I know QAA have included equality, diversity and inclusion in their standards now.
Thanks, Mary. That was a really great answer. John, you've got your hand up. Do you want to come in and ask your question?
Yeah, it's not so much the question really. I mean, first I'd say thanks, Mary, for a really thought-provoking presentation, and I agree with so much of what you say. And I just want to emphasize and reiterate what you're saying about assessments. I've learned how important it is to have diversity of approach and give very a lot of thinking to the way that we assess, the assessment criteria that we use, and the type of assessments we do. And I'm thinking particularly, I had a clinical photography student a couple of years ago who she was a Nigerian British woman who really knew her stuff, but was really constrained with the kind of academic format of the presentation. And when we devised an alternative assessment method for her, you know, she got a first class result in the module, whereas she really struggled with the academic English and the formal structure of doing the essay that was required for that task. And it just made me think of the impact that this has on particularly international students for whom English is not their first language, or students that have come from not a particularly strong academic background, that when we can adapt the assessment type and the assessment criteria and really think about exactly what it is that we're testing, that can work really well.
Thank you, John. I completely agree. I think with assessments, obviously we want our students, and again, this is where we do have to have quite a holistic approach to teaching as well. Like, we want our students to be able to do different forms of assessment. So for instance, I don't want all my students just only be able to do essays. Yeah, in HE we over assess using essays. There are lots of different modes of assessing, and when I'm sort of working with colleagues at Christchurch and externally, one of the things I ask them is, what is the purpose of your assessment? What are your learning outcomes? What is it that you actually want your students to be able to demonstrate that they understand? And so, for instance, quite often I have case files as my assessment. So they will have forensic examination notes, and they will also have an expert witness statement. Both serve completely different functions for me, although they're part of the same assessment. How I assess the forensic examination notes, it's very much about, is their notes fit for purpose? Is it clear? Is it concise? Does it document exactly what they've done as part of their examination? Can somebody repeat it? Whereas with the expert witness statement, I'm checking something else. I am going to look for things like spelling in that as well, because actually it's going to be used in court, and that they could be pulled apart for that. But it is also, is it in lay terms? Is it clear? So very different things. So we need to, us as assessors, we need to understand what we're assessing our students on, and what the purpose of it is. But also, if there are things that students are weaker on, it's about how do we build their confidence, because often it relates back to confidence. How do we build their confidence so that they can actually continue to do that, so that they can get better at that? And often it can be things like working with them to develop a growth mindset, as opposed to a fixed mindset that they can't do something. You mentioned about English as a second language, and it's interesting because often we see that as a deficit, but actually it should be an asset. We should work towards an asset-based model, because if somebody asked me to go to France and learn in French, I'd fail everything because I can't speak a word of French. So, or to do my forensic job in French. And so actually to be able to speak more than one language, we need to start seeing it as an asset. And how do we bring that into our learning space?
Thanks, Mary. That was an amazing answer. Ian asked a question in the chat. Have your colleagues and other modules on the programme taken similar approaches to yourself? So have you influenced them to take this approach forward? Yeah, so for example, the one that I showed you around the students doing and sort of using that problem-based learning and sort of business constructive alignment, and getting them to sort of build that sort of collective knowledge, that approach has been taken by other colleagues. That approach has also won an award as well. But it's also been taken up by colleagues at other institutions as well. So I know that other institutions have used it in not even just forensic programs, but they've used that concept in physics in other STEM programs, to be able to increase the outcomes and retention actually of their students, and it's been quite positive impact. Thank you. And Rachel asks, how can we empower colleagues to change their approaches to their modules to be across the programme if there's no requirement from SMTs, so senior management teams, for example? Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really hard one, because if you've not got senior management buy-in, it can be
you're kind of just relying on colleagues to do something out of the goodness of their own heart. And anybody that works in academia knows how stretched we are. We've got like 1,000,001 things to do. And so it's, if you are somebody that's in a line manager's role, provide that space for your colleagues to be able to do that work. But also, to be honest, Universities UK and the National Union for Students are very much looking at the ethnicity awarding gap and how do we make our curriculum more decolonised and inclusive. And so eventually universities will be monitored on it. I don't think it's long before universities actually get monitored in their ethnicity awarding gaps and the outcomes of their students. And so SMT will have to do that. But also, I think if you can demonstrate the impact of your work, hopefully the SMT will get buy-in. It is hard, I'm not going to lie.
Thank you, Mary. I think there is some comments in the chat as well. I think that's the end of the question. Does anyone else want to come in and ask a question?
I do want to say there are sort of opportunities, if anything. I know sometimes with STEM subjects we can think it's quite hard to decolonise, but it is just looking at the assumptions. So even as forensic scientists, we often talk about Locard's principle, and we put everything down to Locard, but actually there was a lot of other people that was doing similar research in that time. So his principle is based upon other people's work as well. So it's actually looking at that and understanding how has other people's knowledge influenced his knowledge and what he now gets credit for.